On behalf of the International Federation on Aging, welcome to this Vision Health webinar entitled Biosimilars in Ophthalmology, International Policies and Professional Perspectives. My name is Andra Stenku, Project Officer with the IFA, and we'll begin with a brief review of housekeeping. This webinar features remarks from expert speakers who will be introduced shortly. Their biographies will be posted in the chat, and please feel welcome to share comments and resources there as well. Following the speaker interventions, there will be a moderated discussion. Please post any questions for the speakers using the question and answer function rather than the chat. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on the IFA YouTube channel and on the EyeSeeYou program website found in the chat box now. The IFA is grateful to Bayer Canada for the unrestricted educational grant provided to support this webinar and associated program of work. Now, IFA, working alongside Canadian experts and leaders of patient and advocacy organizations, has helped to influence and shape policy to ensure the safe and appropriate treatment for retinal conditions, with special attention to the growing aging population. In 2020, we commenced some pioneering work in the highly complex area of biosimilars in ophthalmology, because this emerging field will impact the lives of an increasing number of Canadians. The IFA has undertaken a comprehensive body of work, including a national and international environmental scan of policy frameworks for biosimilars, which highlights actions needed in the Canadian context. Now, on the global scale, there have been biosimilar policy and legal frameworks developed in a variety of approaches, with repeated calls from stakeholders, including patient organizations, professional associations, clinicians, and individuals, to foster an informed joint decision-making approach between patients and their healthcare professionals. A key policy decision relates to treatment changes between originator biologics and biosimilar therapeutics, which is central to biosimilar frameworks globally, and as such must be considered within the Canadian context. Our consultations have indicated that the level of awareness of these key stakeholders regarding biosimilars in ophthalmology is very low and requires immediate attention, given that policies are already underway to guide their use. Among those who do have some level of awareness, there are concerns which focus around issues of safety, effectiveness, and also access to appropriate treatment options for all Canadians. Through the EyeSeeYou Advocating for Options in Vision Care program, the IFA is leading the conversation alongside and on behalf of the millions of older Canadians experiencing vision loss due to age-related macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy, who rely on regular ophthalmic interventions to prevent further vision loss and maintain functional ability and autonomy. Clinical dialogue and guidance alongside comprehensive patient education are foundational elements of a comprehensive policy plan for the appropriate use of biosimilars in ophthalmology. Older Canadians must have access to treatment options for blinding eye conditions that are safe, effective, and appropriate for their needs and values. Now, within this webinar, you will hear from exceptional speakers and leaders in the field of ophthalmology who will explore critical elements that underpin effective, appropriate, safe, and patient-centered biosimilar policies to ensure Canada's vision care landscape is prepared to respond to the needs of patients, their caregivers, and their healthcare providers. As IFA does not have expertise in the field of ophthalmology, please do note that the perspectives shared by speakers are their own, and we do look forward to an open discussion of any questions posed by participants following their interventions. And it is now my honor to introduce the expert speakers, beginning with Dr. Ashish Sharma. Dr. Sharma completed his Retina Fellowship from the University of California, Irvine, in the United States, where he also served as part-time faculty. He perused his research interests and joined the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute at the University of Miami, Florida. Before joining Lotus Eye Hospital in India, he served as faculty at the L.V. Prasad Eye Institute, also in India. His areas of interest are age-related macular degeneration, diabetic macular edema, and ocular pharmacotherapy, with special emphasis on biosimilars in ophthalmology and recent imaging techniques. He is the innovator of the patent-pending fundus imaging device M2RetCam, and I hope that's correct. He has been awarded as the International Ophthalmologist Education Award by the American Academy of Ophthalmology Board of Trustees. He has over 80 publications in peer-reviewed journals, along with chapters in high-impact journals and books. He is on the reviewing and editorial boards of many high-impact ophthalmology journals, and we're very grateful to you for being with us today. Now I will also introduce our second speaker, Dr. Geoff Williams, who will follow Dr. Sharma in today's order of events. Dr. Geoff Williams is a clinical associate professor of ophthalmology at the University of Calgary. He practices in his office at the Southern Alberta Eye Centre and operates at both the Rocky View Hospital and SAEC Surgical. He began his university education at the University of Calgary, graduating with a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology, and then his medical degree in 1985. In 1990, he completed his ophthalmology residency at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, then moved to New York City to complete a 2-year vitreoretinal fellowship at the Cornell University Medical Center at New York Hospital. He moved back to Calgary, set up practice as a retinal specialist. He later co-founded Calgary Retina Consultants alongside Dr. Amin Kirani, and soon after the Southern Alberta Eye Centre. He is currently the medical director of SAEC Surgical, the director of the Calgary Retinal Fellowship Program, and is active in residency training programs. He is a member of the Retina Society, as well as the Canadian, American, and European Retina Societies. And he has shared that he and his wife, Barbara, have interests in boating, nature photography, architecture, and travel. And their 2 children wakeboard better than their parents. So thank you for sharing that. And we will now move on with the very substantive and comprehensive presentations from today's speakers, starting with Dr. Sharma. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my slides, Andra?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Okay, so Andra, thank you so much, and thank you IFA for giving me this kind of opportunity to be a part of this wonderful initiative that IFA has been doing. So biosimilars in ophthalmology, this has been our favorite topic, quite close to our hearts since last couple of years. And we have been trying to understand various aspects of biosimilars in ophthalmology, starting with the paper which was published in 2018, where we asked whether you can see a big change on the horizon as soon as the biosimilars in ophthalmology, they just get into the approval mode. And this is the new paper. If somebody wants the updated information, recently published in AJO, if you want updated that what is happening in this area, you can refer this publication. So before I move forward, these are my disclosures, and I do have disclosure with one of the company which has been the pioneer in the biosimilar of ranibizumab, which is approved right now only in India, but they have initiated the EMA and the FDA filing, that is in TAS India. Now let us just understand few terms. What are biologics basically? If you look at the EMA definition, EMA says that any medicinal product containing biotechnology derived proteins as active substance is called biologic. So essentially what you mean is that these drugs, they come from the living organisms. Living organisms, they play a very important role. So these drugs can involve animal or microorganisms such as yeast or bacteria. So that's where you have the difference from the conventional medication, which is very, very important for us to understand, because that's where the confusion comes in. That's where the regulatory differences comes in. So other conventional medications are basically the chemicals. They are fixed formulas. For example, if you look at the biologics, especially, I would just refer the biologics which are the innovator biologics, or you can say they are reference biologics, they are originator biologics. There are two major drugs which have transformed the way we have been treating the medical retinal diseases in ophthalmology. One is ranibizumab, which was approved first, and then after some time, aflibercept, which is also being used quite well. Conventional medication, you all know, ibuprofen, paracetamol, these are chemicals. So chemicals are easy to manufacture. However, ranibizumab, aflibercept, these are all biologics. Biologics takes really long time to manufacture, and you require a real good machinery framework along with the regulatory also. So let us come to the biosimilar, for which we are trying to, we are sitting here and we are talking about it. We are trying to understand various aspects about it. So biosimilar is essentially a biologic. But how they get approval is they need to really show that they are very, very similar to the reference biologic. A reference biologic is nothing but the existing product which has already been approved by the FDA or EMA, that means the regulatory authority. How they need to produce the similarity is that safety, purity, and the potency, each and everything has to be similar. But as I said, these are the different molecules. They depend on the microorganisms. They depends on the living organisms. So they are not the chemical formulas. So they cannot be the exact copy. So there could be some differences, but regulatory makes sure that these differences are not clinically meaningful. So let us understand again once here. For example, on the left side, if you see, there is an original drug, which is a conventional chemical formula. On the other side means you can, let's say the example ibuprofen, you can have the exact copy by the different companies. However, a biologic, reference biologic, and the biosimilar, there would be some differences, but they would not be clinically meaningful. That is the only way they get approval from the regulatory authorities. Now, next question that we should all ask is, why actually do you need biosimilars? There are predominantly two reasons. One is you save a lot of money. Each and every healthcare system want to save money, whatever they spend on the healthcare, and they would like to provide medications to more and more number of people. So on estimated, biosimilars can save consumers as much as $250 million and $1 billion, and they can provide additional care to the 1.2 million populations by 2025. And why does that happen? If you look at the, manufacturing of reference biologic, it takes 10 to 15 years. For a single molecule, you need to spend approximately $1,200 to $2,500 million. However, biosimilar, for the similar biologic, you can make it, companies can make it in 8 to 10 years with 1/10 of the cost. So that's where the cost saving comes in. Now, next question is, when a biosimilar can be approved in a particular country? This varies. That varies according to the proprietary rights and according to the regulatory authorities. For example, FDA, EMA, they have a different exclusivity. India, I'm putting here because we have approved our biosimilar in 2015. India behaves in a different way. If you have some drug which has already been successfully used outside India for 4 years, you can manufacture it here. So each and every country differs here. Now I'll talk about the biosimilars in ophthalmology, why this year is so important. Why are we discussing it today? Why this topic is so important as of now? Because the ranibizumab, which gave a transition of the ophthalmology practice, especially the medical retinal practice, patent is expiring this year. It was supposed to expire last year, but because of the COVID situation, most likely means this would expire this year and after a couple of years in Europe. And aflibercept has still some time. The patent would expire in 2027. Other China and the Japan, it's 2022. So this is the high time that we understand about these molecules. So as of now, look at, so many companies are involved, and all these companies which are working on the ranibizumab biosimilar, they are almost in the phase 3 stages. India has approved its first biosimilar of ranibizumab in 2015, and we have been using that quite successfully since last 5 and 6 years. Aflibercept still has some time, but still you can see a lot of companies are, having their good pipeline in this direction. And probably the first ophthalmic biosimilar that would be approved by the FDA or EMA would be SB11, because it has shown its robust results. Recently, it was published in JAMA. Now, look at the important aspect as far as the approval pathway is concerned. If you really want to look at one agency which has the maximum experience of biosimilar, you should look at the EMA. EMA has formulated its guidelines in 2005. They approved the first biosimilar in the world in 2006. So they have a list of biosimilars that those are approved. However, FDA, they have streamlined their policies in 2015 quite late. So FDA has taken some cues from EMA, but they still have their own system and thoughts. I'm putting India here because we are experienced in terms of the first ophthalmic biosimilar, which was approved in 2015. And this is a very important slide. I would like your attention on this slide, because this is the slide which tells us that why the cost comes down with the biosimilar development, and why approval pathways slightly different in both of them. If you look at on the left side, there is an upside down pyramid. So what happens during the approval aspect of the inventor, or you can say innovator molecule, reference molecules of these biologics, they need very minimal analytical data, because this is the first time some drug they are testing. So they do not know that how the drug is going to behave in patients. So if you look on the top, the widest area of this pyramid is a clinical trial. So they need to have more and more clinical trial with longer period. On the flip side, if you look on the right side, this is a normal pyramid with a cone at the top. And at the bottom, if you see, you have the analytical studies and the preclinical studies. And at the top, at the apex, you see the minimal clinical phase. Why is that? Because they know that they know how the drug behaves. They know they need to just show the bioequivalence to the existing drug. They need to just show that this drug is similar in terms of safety and efficacy. So their targets are defined. That is the reason that you do not need many patients in the clinical trial. Pharmacovigilance, yes, each and every regulatory authority has pharmacovigilance. It is not specific to the biosimilars. They are similar to all the medications. They always do that once the drug is marketed. Now let us come to the common discussion point that we have faced in many of the forums, that what people talk about. So nomenclature of biosimilars, there is still no clarity. FDA says that you could have the 4-letter suffix, which can have the lowercase letters, which they don't mean anything, just to identify biosimilar different from the biologics. But EMA doesn't feel that necessity. WHO also came up with some kind of qualifier scheme. So actually speaking, none of the regulatory is in sync here. What EMA think is, you can give a name, but if you have some kind of batch number, it is easy to identify with the batch number of the drug. Now, extrapolation, very important aspect, because it is important question by the patients and the physicians both. What do you really mean by the extrapolation is, if the drug is approved for one indication, then it can be approved without the clinical trials for the other indications. For example, if any biosimilar drug gets the approval for the macular degeneration, it doesn't need to do more trial for RVO and the DME. However, an originator molecule has to have the trial for both each and every indication. So extrapolation is allowed. This is, to avoid the repetition of unnecessary trial. That's, where the biosimilar, they save a lot of money. But indeed, extrapolation should be supported by all the scientific evidences gathered for the approval authority, because they see each and every aspect, that whether they are similar or not. Now, another important topic, interchangeability. Interchangeability could be switching or substitution. The way EMA defines it, switching can be done at the physician level, but substitution can be done at the pharmacist level. And EMA has no direct directive for this. EMA gives it authority to all the EU member states. Whatever they decide, they can do it. FDA says that interchangeable product, if you want to have any biosimilar, they need to meet additional requirement for the FDA, additional testing. And as on today, there is no FDA approved interchangeable medication. India behaves in a very different way. We have no formal guidelines in terms of the interchangeability, because our clinic works differently. Each and every time we discuss with the patient that these are the options. We tell them this is biosimilar, this is original biologic, and then it's a call from the patient, which I feel is more practical. Switching can be defined as any drug can be switched from the reference drug to the biosimilar. Switching can be back switching also from biosimilar to the reference drug, and switching could be between two biosimilars also. Why the switching is important? Because sometimes all these biosimilar drugs, they have protein as a component, so immunogenicity is an issue. Sometimes people feel switching might make some difference, because India already has approved biosimilar. So we try to test and publish this data, that how the switching affects the immunogenicity and the efficacy from the original ranibizumab to the ranibizumab biosimilar. We did not find any difference. Now, common queries of the patients and the physicians: why is the clinical trial so short with fewer patients? I've already told you that they just need to show the bioequivalence, so it is not really needed. And in case some clinical trial data, extra data is required, regulatory, they look at it and they direct the companies to do so. Second question, is it the same drug? It is not the same drug. So you should be very clear that it is not the same drug, but it is very similar drug, except some components which are not clinically active, and they are very well governed. Third is it safe? Question by the physicians and the patients. It is very, very safe, because if it is not safe, and if it's not safe equally to the innovator molecules, they do not get approval. Fourth question is, will it be as effective as the reference drugs? Again, the same answer that I gave you in the third questions. Yes, if they are not as effective as the reference drug, they do not get approval. So as I told you, there are a lot of questions from the patients and the physicians. So there's always a kind of a negative perception, which we define as a nocebo effect, which revolves around the biosimilars. So education is very, very important. And FDA is trying to educate. Even if you look at the EMA site, you have a patient site and you have a physician site. You can have a look at it and then read, so there's a lot of education material which is available there. So if you really want to have confidence in the biosimilars, look at this statement. In Europe, in last 10 years, they have not identified any relevant difference in the nature, severity, or frequency of adverse event between any of the biosimilars from the reference medications. Now, this is again a very important slide. I would like to have your attention on it, because ophthalmology biosimilar future depends on this one medication. Because how the biosimilars, they are going to play a role in a country, it depends on this medication, because that's where the differentiation comes. Why is that? I'll explain you. Bevacizumab is a medication which is available at $50 to $100 per injection in the United States. And probably, I'm not sure about the Canada, but probably in the Canada too. Dr. Williams can, he can share that information. And that is easily available. A lot of people use it and it is effective. A lot of studies like CAT have already defined it that the drug is quite safe. So essentially, bevacizumab is a wonderful drug for the countries which have good compounding pharmacies. But this drug is being blamed for infections many times in developing countries like India, because we do not have that good compounding pharmacies everywhere. So the future of a biosimilar is good in India. We have tested it, but to beat this price is difficult for a biosimilar in a developing world. For example, ranibizumab originator molecule cost around $2,000 per injection, but even if a biosimilar of ranibizumab gets approval, they cannot price it more than 25% discount. So probably that would cost around between $1,000 to $1,500, which is still 10 times more than the bevacizumab. So it is yet to be seen that how biosimilars would cater the competition with the bevacizumab, which is easily available in developed world. So as far as the overall biosimilar market is concerned, you can take experience from EMA, but if you really want to take experience in terms of the ophthalmology, retinal biosimilars, India is a country to look at, because we have experienced biosimilar since last 6 years, and the biosimilars of ranibizumab was first approved in India in 2015. And initially, what happened was, in a couple of batches, there were reports of anterior segment inflammation, hardly some 7 to 8 cases, but it was highlighted well. It was highlighted because that's what the competition does. But as I told, the pharmacovigilance is very strong, and after realizing that that was happening because of the buffer, so company took the action, and since after that episode, the drug is quite safe and is being really well utilized, and it has taken a good market share of the innovator molecule here. So what I would say, and the lesson from India, is strict pharmacovigilance is the key if you really want to have give the confidence to the users and the patients. So in nutshell, biosimilars are the future for various countries. It can save a lot of costs for not only for the health system, but for patients also, and medication can be provided to many more patients, and there has to be an education which it plays a very important role here, and I think for that we are here. Thank you so much, and once again, thank you so much IFA for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you, Dr. Sharma. You have really made the case that biosimilars in ophthalmology are not on the horizon, but they are here, and there do remain questions about the language or the nomenclature, safety around switching, of course, the consideration of cost, which is an important factor, and for raising the issue of pharmacovigilance. So thank you very much for underscoring the importance and the urgency of this issue. And we're so delighted to have you for this presentation. And we would now like to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Geoff Williams. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. I'll just share my screen here. And so like Dr. Sharma, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Jane Barrett and the International Federation of Aging for the invitation to speak. And like Dr. Sharma, a few disclosures. Of course, none of them involve any biosimilars, as they have not yet come to Canada. And so this is going to be just the rundown of my talk, the next 5 topics. So we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory approval process internationally as well as Canada, and hope to build on what Dr. Sharma has said. He's much more accomplished in this area. Obviously, I'm learning, trying to bring some Canadian perspective to this. Talk a little bit about the safety and efficacy of biologics and biosimilars, and the issues around that, and how those issues then affect the patient, doctor, and payer perspectives. followed by some questions about future access. So Dr. Sharma covered this really. Why biosimilars? Well, it's very much cost. A tenth of the cost is clearly a good thing to see for both governments in terms of their budgets, but also access to more people around the world for the various indications for these very life-changing drugs. And the approval process has just begun, as Dr. Sharma mentioned. Started, in Europe in 2005, Japan and Korea in 2009. Canada came along in 2010, and the U.S. and India have formalized theirs in 2012. But as he mentioned, India is the first to have an actual biosimilar on the market and in play. And this was on the basis of the 2015 trial involving 100 patients. And of course, if they have 104 patients, that's going to cost less to get that approved through their regulatory process or any regulatory process as compared to the original biologic, which has to provide perhaps the data on 1,200 to 2,400 patients in registration trials. And this is kind of what the map looks like around the world, where the blue countries here listed are the biosimilars with regulations already enacted in various years, and orange, there's no biosimilar regulation. No big surprise in Greenland, I suppose, and some countries with in development, which are the pink ones. And as I mentioned, India was the first to approve a biosimilar, and others are coming. So there will be bevacizumab biosimilars, ranibizumab biosimilars, and as you mentioned, aflibercept biosimilars, all of which are currently under development in phase 3, not that far away in some other countries. As you mentioned, the patent run out will be a little bit later in parts of the world for aflibercept, but perhaps a little bit sooner in Japan. And so there are some regulatory issues around, differences, I guess you could say, with all of these countries. So currently, Canada has not approved any biosimilars in ophthalmology. Others are coming, and they are looking at the mechanisms by which to do this. And one of them would be to look at what are other countries doing and how are they pricing them. And so there's currently discussions with other countries such as Australia, Singapore, Switzerland to form a consortium. And at this point, most of the countries do not have any policies yet on switching. Those are still within the realm of the physician to decide. But I think we will see policies in that area change, as we have already seen in some areas, in some jurisdictions. So then, how do these policies have an impact? Well, these policies will have a very strong impact in terms of how they are used, when they are used, in what situations. So for example, in Norway, you might have a single winner tender process, so that the cheapest might be applied and then switching is allowed. In Poland, also the switching may be allowed and the tendering process might be a little bit different. In the UK, they may have a policy of demanding that the cheapest product be started first and only switch if you can show that there's a lack of efficacy. So this is going to impact the development and the use of biosimilars as compared to the original biologics in these various countries. And so this makes it very important that the physicians especially are educated on the differences and the similarities of these medications. And the pricing is also going to be an interesting field in terms of how these biosimilars are going to compete with the original biologics. And so interestingly, Austria had or developing a process whereby the first biosimilar would come in would have to be 38% lower than the reference biologic. And then if a second biosimilar were to be developed, that would have to be 15% lower than that. And so it is preventing perhaps the Me Too biosimilars being developed too rapidly, because there would have to be a clear price advantage and still meet all the regulatory requirements. So that's one approach. Other approaches will be, incentives to prescribe or incentives to substitute. And currently, amongst the 15 countries so far that are developing these processes, there will be incentives to prescribe them in about half of them, and maybe substituting in about a quarter of them. So that's some of the international things. What about Canada? Well, Canada is still tied very strongly to the US market through the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, however you want to call it. And in essence, that ties our patent terms to other countries, including the US. And that still leaves the patent law at about 20 years. But there are still protected terms for some drugs between 8 and 12 years after their marketing and approval. So that area, I think, is still yet to be defined. And if anybody has an answer to it, I had trouble finding it within the current legislation. But there are, biosimilars approved in Canada, just not yet marketed. A couple of bevacizumab approvals. And why? Well, here's the growth that we're going to see in the biologic market of up to $7 billion in the coming years, and it will probably only grow. But right now, the biosimilar sales is only about 1.9% of that market. Now, that's not including ophthalmology. That's really the oncologic and rheumatologic applications of biologics. But this is where ophthalmology will start to participate in this. And the overall share of the pharmaceutical market, as you can see, is quite large. It's about 30% in Canada. And most of the developed countries are, at least a quarter to a third of their drug costs are going to be biologics. And the USA is a bit of a outlier, perhaps, in terms of the per capita sales. It's much more in the US, but Canada is close to the top in terms of the dollars spent per capita. And this is also showing that if you use Canada as a reference of 1.0, the US is obviously very different from the rest of the world. We all know that. Switzerland and Germany are very similar to us. And then most of the other countries are actually in a pretty close range for the amount spent on originator biologics. And nevertheless, Canada is still a bit behind some of the other countries in terms of comparing to Europe and the US as to how many of these are approved and are coming. And we'll get into, there may be some reasons for that. What are going to be some of the factors that influence the biosimilar uptake in Canada? Well, number one, most of the biosimilars are not interchangeable, so they're not allowed to simply switch by someone other than the physician. We have payer policies in terms of which are covered and which are not, and how these are going to be either marketed or pushed through the hospitals. We have to remember that we have 10 different healthcare conglomerates, and one for each province and the territories. So it's different in every province, and therefore the policies in those provinces are also going to affect how these biosimilars get used in relation to their originator biologic. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about the safety and efficacy, because now I want to switch a little bit towards what's effective. And Dr. Sharma mentioned that, yes, they are very safe. We've seen the main issue of being inflammation in both biologics, and we would expect to see the same thing in biosimilars because they are made in such a way that they're often involve bacterial cells. Those bacterial cell walls can contain endotoxins, and those in turn can be very inflammatory. So those can create problems in some patients, and there's bound to be some differences based on the original biologic production method and the new biosimilar biologic production method, and creating differences. So that's something that we will expect to have to watch out for. We've already, as I mentioned, we've already seen it with abicipar, which was unfortunately withdrawn because of the inflammatory issue. There's been very recent issues around brolucizumab, very powerful agent, perhaps works better, but maybe held back a little bit by some of those inflammatory concerns. But keeping in mind that it's still not as bad as, for the most part, as having an actual infectious process, which is what we all fear the most. And Dr. Sharma mentioned the nocebo effect, and I think that's also very important. If you have the positive effect that by taking a sugar pill that you expect to get better and you do get better, that's a placebo effect. But also you want to avoid the negative perception that just because it's different that it should be inferior, and that may not necessarily be the case. So how does all this play in with the doctor-patient relationship? Well, I'm going to use this example from the View 1 and View 2 studies. So this is the reference studies for aflibercept with 1,200 patients in View 1 and 1,200 patients in View 2. And so a massive amount of work that goes into this. But I want you to sort of keep in mind when you're following these vision improvement lines, that this is a grand averaging of all of the people in those studies. So some people may not have improved at all. Some people may have improved massively. But when you're the patient, you're kind of hoping and expecting you're going to be on this line that when you start getting treatment for your macular degeneration, that this is how you're going to improve. And this is kind of how the doctor expects to see you improve. And likewise, similar curve for brolucizumab, maybe just a little bit less frequent dosing. So these are very important to the patient. And then what if you have a slightly different? Well, I'm going to use a slide from Protocol I, which goes back many years, but it was a difference in terms of how you treated perhaps with a anti-VEGF at the beginning or a steroid at the beginning for someone with diabetic macular edema. And if you are on this line close to the top, that's kind of where you want to be, on the orange line, and that's great. And you didn't know, but what if you were getting another biosimilar that wasn't quite producing that same result? You might never ever get to the same vision point. And this is something you don't know and the doctor doesn't know when you start the treatment. So this is why the studies have to show some confidence in how similar those biosimilars really are to the originator biologic. And another point that's very important for the patient is also what happens if there's a delay. So again, this is going back to another older study, which involved sham injections for the first 6 months versus the ranibizumab for diabetic macular edema. And of course, you see how much you improve. And we talk about area under the curve. You'd rather be this patient who's improved rather than the patient who was delayed. And then if you then initiate treatment, well, it might take you quite some time. If you carry this curves out, they do eventually get close to each other, but it takes another year or two to catch up to the people who improved immediately. And so for the patient and the doctor, you want the confidence that you're going to be on that improved curve, because if you have a delay, well, you might not get as good a result. And so this is part of the reason why very often, me personally, I like to start with what I believe is the originator product so that I know that I'm on this curve as much as I possibly can be for that individual patient. So how does that all meld in with Canada and the regulations and future access to drugs? Well, there are, as I mentioned, policies on switching and substitution currently in Canada and many jurisdictions. There is no substitution allowed, so that's the red labeled countries. The orange ones are no clear-cut law, and the green is there's restricted substitution. And I think it's important that the patient know and the physician know that switch is not being made without their knowledge. And also there will be other issues in terms of how these are brought to market and access in terms of the price regulation. There's got to be regulatory harmonization, if you will, maybe between some of the countries. Clinical guidelines will have an effect in terms of how they are used. Which ones do you use first? As I mentioned, you want to prevent delays. There will be switch studies, and I think that's where India will be a leader in terms of showing us how the switching process goes and how well it might go in those areas. And that's important that then those become available to the physician and the patient for the public education. And then, there's role for advocacy on the patient for whatever may work better. There's currently a number of these initiatives in Canada, and I think that this is where I come back to the 10 different jurisdictions. But Quebec currently just reimburses the lowest price version of infliximab. In Manitoba, they're suggesting that you have to try the less expensive medication first and then the second. British Columbia may be the first to initiate switching. Alberta, there's been a policy on changing a lot of the rheumatologic drugs in a mandatory fashion with some controversy around that. And then even the private payers may have a role to play, perhaps in even allowing you to upgrade your drug to something that if you would rather prefer and it costs more, well, maybe you can add that in. So I think it's important that the patient and the doctor have the knowledge and be able to be the strongest participants in that process. And the last point I'm just going to make is that you have to be careful in terms of how much you push the lower cost alternatives, because then you want to leave a space for the innovators to come up with new drugs. So this is an article by Brett Skinner in the Financial Post just last year, arguing that artificially pushing down the prices to a lot of drugs can possibly lead to a situation where those drugs may not even be brought to Canada. And we've already seen some examples of that in terms of some drugs are released in some countries and not others. So, we don't want to be in a situation where we reduce the availability of new medications or allow the playing field to allow for new innovators to come. So this is asking for a lot of balance between all of the various stakeholders in this discussion. And, you can probably put 5 different wants for every one of these questions, but the government might want stable budgets and lower costs, and same for an insurer. They might want less. The patient wants the best result. Hopefully the doctor wants the confidence that he's getting the patient the best result. What does the pharmacist role play? Are they allowed to switch or not? What does the originator by a pharmaceutical company want in terms of the playing field to bring the next new best drug in place? And then, what does the biosimilar company want? Well, I'm sure both of the companies want, a stable regulatory process where they understand the process upfront. So I'd like to thank everyone for your attention and look forward to the question and answer session.
And thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Again, it's a very discerning look at the implications of this emerging field on the Canadian context. You've shared some clinical perspectives on the impact of some of the treatments on vision loss, preventing it. And you've highlighted some issues that are really specific to Canada regarding differences in jurisdictions. I would just like to share, while we do welcome questions from attendees using the question and answer function. Oh, and we do have a question from Dr. Jane Barrett, and the question she has posed is, safe and appropriate treatments which are well informed must be at the heart of patient care. What would be recommendations from each of you to influence policies?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I didn't hear the last part. What would be the?
Sure. So recommendations to influence policy such that it's framed primarily around patient care and empowering patients and ensuring functional ability can be maintained and further vision loss prevented.
So I would answer that just by saying that I think it's important for the policies to allow the physician and patient relationship to be primary in terms of how the choices are made. There may be regulations around how much that budgetary costs in total, so there may be some requirements to at least try the medications in some circumstances, but ultimately I would hope to see that the physician and patient are both aware and largely in control of what that switch or process looks like.
I think regarding the policy, if there's education, and the education, I think that's the most important aspect of the biosimilars, because there's definite nocebo impact which should be negated. So as soon as any country which prepare, any policy maker, if they want to bring these drugs, the first and foremost thing is, before they enter into the market in advanced, policymakers should have the education started. Means that's what I would say. On their website, the way EMA does it, it does brilliant. It's very clear-cut information for the patients and for the physicians. So, patient and the physician, they come on board on one table with pre-informed, and then the discussion takes place between a physician and the patient, after that. So I think that is the way that I would see it.
Thank you very much. And further to both of your points, I would just like to share a recent report that the IFA completed, gathering perspectives on emerging biosimilars in ophthalmology in Canada. And some stakeholders did indicate that some opportunities for actions were to empower older Canadians to have an active role in managing their vision care. Further to that, some questions arose about how to tackle the issue of differences across jurisdictions to ensure that all Canadians do have access. And I apologize, Dr. Sharma, for coming back to the Canadian context, but the issue of having differences and perhaps might impact how one person accesses versus another. And so I would be interested in your comments on, first of all, empowering your patients. So what are some support mechanisms that perhaps you might recommend, and what are immediate actions that we can have a role in impacting and taking effect?
I think Dr. Williams can give this answer from the Canadian perspective.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Could you just repeat that last question again? I'd had trouble hearing it.
Sure. So on the one hand, we want to ensure that older Canadians are able to be empowered and take an active role in managing their vision care. What are some perhaps support mechanisms that should be put in place, and what are action items that we, on this webinar, civil society, but also professional associations and those who are aware of the impact, what can we be doing now?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I agree with Dr. Sharma in terms of the education component. I think it's very important for the patient and the physician, and of course that was highlighted in other parts of the presentation as well. And so, but people also need to have the confidence in those medications as they come in. So one of the issues I have is just that there's not very many patients in the studies that make the comparison of the biosimilar to the biologic. And I think that could be perhaps more robustly done to give everyone the confidence that those are truly similar. And in that regard, then the associations for ophthalmology can play a role in terms of encouraging that and perhaps encouraging that in the regulatory process. So that everyone has the confidence that these medications are going to be equivalent enough for their widespread use.
And I think Janet asked the right question, because I think I'm reading her question that, professional associations takes in educating clinicians. Very important, because I can tell my experience when the first biosimilar of ranibizumab was launched in India, we had few reactions with a couple of batches. And I was on podium, I was criticizing it, to be frank. So unless, it takes time. It takes time to develop confidence in something which is new. So I can share my experience that it took me almost 6 months to a year before I really started prescribing and having confidence in the drug. So start that from the beginning. So that's what, as an association, that you can play an important role in educating as soon as you see, this is coming.
Certainly, thank you both. I just conscious of time, I would like to invite both of you to share kind of takeaway messages. So we have discussed, the international policies, some regulatory frameworks, and perhaps their applications within the Canadian context as an emerging field and a quickly emerging field. So perhaps Dr. Sharma, if I may ask for a couple of key messages, and then I will ask Dr.
So basically, biosimilars are the future. Especially, I am from a developing world and I have seen the journey. So I would say that be confident in your regulatory, and you as an association, please build a confidence, have the leaflets, have the flyers on your IFA website, probably, where people can really have the real education and make an informed decision. Clinicians and physicians, clinicians and the patients both needs an education here. The molecules are good and very well governed.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Dr. Williams?
Thank you. Well, I would like to just make the point that I think that the regulatory process has to be clear so that the confidence is developed in those new biosimilars as they become available. And I agree that it will take time for that confidence to develop. And I think that it's also important that that we not rush headlong into creating a framework that would not allow the new drugs to come up behind, because it can't all be about price. It's got to be about efficacy and availability. So it's a very interesting topic, and we will be talking about this more, I'm sure.
Thank you both very much for your presentations. Now, within this webinar, you've both made a very compelling case to understand the implication of biosimilars in ophthalmology on the vision health landscape within Canada. And while the IFA has started this dialogue, we now call on you participants and those who are interested to elevate the discourse and further engage your colleagues and networks to amplify the substantive messages that you've shared today. We call on patient and aging organizations to become interested in the implications of biosimilar policy frameworks on the right to make choices about your vision health treatment, and to advocate for millions of older people who are experiencing vision loss today. And moreover, we do call on the engagement of vision health professionals and professional associations, without whom those leaflets and pamphlets cannot be, adequately created, shared, and really evidence-based. And so we call on professionals to be involved in shaping and developing the forthcoming policies with the discerning guidance and expertise. And to close, on behalf of IFA, we thank you for your participation today and invite you to visit the website EyeSeeYou.care for further updates, upcoming opportunities to influence policies on the use of biosimilars in ophthalmology in Canada. So thank you both once again for your very comprehensive presentations.